As the last arriving guests take their seats, good evening once again, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Pakhuis de Zwijger. Tonight's event is entitled Export Arms, Import Refugees. We will ask the question, is Europe prioritizing arms exports over conflict prevention and solving the refugee crisis in regions where refugees are coming from to Europe? Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Ali El Jabri. I'm a professional moderator. I work with communications firm Debating Skills. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. This event is the 25th edition of the Vluchtroute or Escape Route series. So far, the series has dealt primarily with the refugee crisis from the moment that the refugees arrive to Europe. Tonight we will take a step back and ask questions about the root causes behind the conflicts that refugees are seeking to flee from. In particular, we will ask, is European involvement through arms sales contributing to those conflicts? What should we do about these arms sales? We'll also touch upon direct Western military intervention in regions such as Afghanistan, Iraq, and Yemen. We will also look at the perspective of some representatives of migrant communities in Amsterdam. At all times, you are all encouraged to participate in our discussions, and I'll make sure that it becomes clear to you when it is time for that. Our program tonight is as follows. We'll first look at the case of Afghanistan, a nation where many refugees are coming from and have come from historically to Europe, and where there's a long history of Western military intervention and arms sales. Subsequently, we'll have a presentation by Stop Wapenhandel, or Stop Arms Trade, about the current status of European arms exports and production. Then we'll have a panel discussion with politicians and members of civil society trying to limit and/or differently regulate arms trade. And finally, we will conclude with the case of Yemen, yet another place where European military intervention, or at least arms sales, are at hand and where refugees are coming from, although in the Netherlands only to a limited extent. This program is brought to you in collaboration with Stop Arms Trade, Het Grote Midden-Oosten Platform, the Great Middle East Platform, PAX, and Stand Up for Afghans Amsterdam. Welcome again. Now, without further ado, allow me to invite to the floor to speak about Afghanistan, Najib Azad, Afghan student in the Netherlands and activist with Stand Up for Afghanistan, for Afghans, from Amsterdam. I'm also inviting to the floor Suja Shams, born in Kabul, currently studying philosophy and European studies at the University of Amsterdam. Please give them a big hand. Let me open this discussion. And by the way, you'll have a chance to ask questions in a few minutes. Let me open by asking Najib. As said, Europe and its allies, such as the United States, have had a long historic involvement in Afghanistan, militarily also. What has the impact been of this involvement, according to you?
Well, the impact, as we all know, has been worse. The situation has been getting worse every day. Before 9/11, there were only 4 terrorist groups in my country, but now there are more than 21 terrorist groups. That has been a visible impact that the global media is not focusing on. The only problem with the global media is that you guys don't see news about Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq on the headlines. Yesterday, 50 clerics died in my country in a suicide attack. But people in the West don't hear these news. They hear about the birthday of Queen Elizabeth or Harry and Meghan tying a tie. Or imagine a person gets killed in Amsterdam. It will be a headline all over the world, but 50 persons died in Afghanistan yesterday. Nobody's hearing about it. And about the impact of the war in Afghanistan, there are more than 20 terrorist groups, as I said, and BBC report says that more than 70% of the country is currently controlled by the Taliban. So Taliban is only one of the terrorist groups in the country. There are more than 20 other terrorist groups in the country. So now imagine how insecure the country is as a whole. Like my own hometown, I come from Ghazni province in Jowhari district. It was attacked by the Taliban 10 days ago, and the attack is still going on. My family has fled my hometown. they have come to Kabul. Kabul is not safe either. But because people in Afghanistan believe Kabul is going to be the last place the Taliban is going to take over, because all of the American troops or the European troops that are based in Afghanistan will have Kabul as the last safest position. So everybody is fleeing to Kabul.
Thank you very much, Najib, for this update. Suja, what is your take on this? What has the impact been of Western military involvement in Afghanistan? Could you also, in particular, zoom in at what this impact has been for Afghan women?
Yes, I will primarily focus on the early 1960s and 70s and the rise of the Mujahideen. That was also the main reason why my parents fled the country in the 90s. Afghanistan in the 1960s was a country that started to reform. The previous government was very much in favor of restructuring the society, like the society of Afghanistan. It is in my experience, like the way my parents look at the war, it's more of like, well, we fled the country because of the rise of Mujahideen, who were supported by the United States. In that regard, of course, I mean, the United States had a benefit, which was to get rid of communism, because our former government was cooperating with the Soviet Union. But we're in fear of communism, but we're supporting conservative extremist Islamic groups such as the Mujahideen that were actually wanting to prevent women's rights. And nowadays, Afghanistan is a country where approximately 80% of the women is a victim of domestic violence. It is a country where women are prevented from going to school.
Statistics show, for instance, that almost half of the judges in Afghanistan before US involvement were women. And there are many statistics to show that in many ways, Afghanistan, at least statistically, was doing better than many Western European countries. So you're saying that the involvement of the West, militarily speaking, also has deteriorated, made the women's situation worse in Afghanistan?
Well, there has been a lot of initiatives that were taken by the government, like even in the 1930s, to reform the country and encourage rights for women. So even the monarchy, because Afghanistan became a republic in 1973, but the monarchy also implemented rights for women. So the women were studying, were working in the 60s and the 70s. They were very overrepresented in the academic world, in the medical world, and our previous king was busy with these reforms, and the image of Afghanistan and the Afghan women was so unique that something similar like that has not repeated ever since.
Let's go from history to the present situation in Afghanistan. I spoke to Najib right before this discussion, and we talked about the use of private military contractors in Afghanistan. Could you tell us about that, and how has this changed the situation in Afghanistan?
Well, after 9/11, from 2001 till 2014, the US military and other European countries, because Afghanistan was very insecure, they couldn't risk their own lives to go and fight against the insurgency and also take care of the places around the country. So they hired local contractors. And former president of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, he said in an interview that his biggest fault during his presidency, 14 years presidency, was privatization of military, because that was the same thing that the Americans did with the Mujahideen. So basically, who was owning these local contractors? They were the previous Mujahideen guys who had a lot of money and had a lot of people and got paid by the international community to function all around the country. So it's basically the same Mujahideen thing happening as private contractors after 9/11. And also the development approach that the international community took in Afghanistan was pretty wrong, pretty wrong because after 9/11, they distributed Afghanistan between themselves. For example, Netherlands was taking ownership of Oruzgan province. So in Oruzgan, you had only Dutch military. So Dutch military was implementing education projects, building dams and planting trees in a very non-collaborative way comparing to what was happening in other provinces and what they were doing. For example, if they were building a school, they were going with a military convoy to inaugurate the school. Like imagine you go inaugurate a school in a Taliban area with a military convoy and a European ambassador. That doesn't work because the Taliban will come the next day, blow it up. And a lot of children have died that way. The development approach we have taken in Afghanistan has been pretty wrong, yeah.
Speaking of education, one of your own interests is research on education. Could you tell us about Western policies on education in Afghanistan? And I think there might be a slide also to illustrate what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah. So education for me personally is very important to change the situation in Afghanistan. Like since 17 years after 9/11, now the illiteracy rate in Afghanistan is 70%, which means 70% of Afghan population cannot read and write. Where are these terrorists getting hired from? They're getting hired from this because they are illiterate. And the photo that you're seeing is from Afghan textbooks which were printed by University of Nebraska, an academic institution in US in 1979 during the Cold War.
These books are still used?
These books were used till 2005, but not anymore. I'm going to talk about that. So they spent $60 million to print such textbooks for Afghan schools. Like imagine you're sending your kid to school and the first day they're learning counting by counting guns, grenades, and all of the other military equipments that you see in the photo. And in the next one it says Deen. Dal is an alphabet in our language, in Dari. Dal is like D. When you send your kids to school, they learn the alphabet D by learning that D is for dog. But in Afghanistan, D was for Deen, which means religion. And what they learned about religion is that our religion is Islam. I'm translating that, and Russians are the enemy of Islam. Who are Russians? Russians are infidels. In the footnote, it says that, dear teacher, please describe who Russians are. And the teacher had to describe that Russians are infidels. Who are the Americans now in Afghanistan? Who are Dutch people or Dutch army? Who are these people in Afghanistan who are not Afghans? They are not infidels. I personally don't believe anyone is infidel in this world. We all believe in something or don't believe in something. We should have respect for our beliefs. But the way these textbooks, school textbooks have influenced Afghanistan, I'm sure those people who are fighting with the Taliban or with Al-Qaeda now are kids who were studying these textbooks back in 1979. They are 40 years old now, fighting what they have learned.
So when we're talking about militarization, perhaps this is what you're saying in relation to the topic of tonight. When we're talking about militarization, it's not about guns and weapons, but also about the ideology that is produced and taught. Going back to Suje, you're also a Dutch citizen.
Yeah.
Uruzgan was already mentioned. The Dutch government or the Dutch military will stay in Afghanistan as it stands now until 2021. What do you think of the Dutch mission in Afghanistan?
Well, when you hear these stories and you're very up to date of what happens in Afghanistan itself, it becomes very controversial. But I would like to give an example of how this comes back in the educational system in the Netherlands, and also part of the academic debate. Well, as I said, as you introduced me, I study European studies, and in one of my courses, teacher, which was a great teacher, so nothing personally, mentioned the example of the war in Afghanistan and how we as citizens, whether we are aware of how our tax money is spent and whether we are willing to spend our money to help people in war, primarily women. I mean, to me, as a first-generation refugee from Afghanistan sitting there in class, it was quite weird because I thought, well, I think the students, the European students, deserve to know that their tax money is also being used for extremist groups, right? So the course, to get it straight, the course was not about the history of the Cold War, it was a course about capitalism. And I think that when you speak about capitalism, you also have to speak about bloodshed, at least from my experience of many others with me. So there is a Eurocentric view on how we view the war in the Middle East, and I think that needs to be clarified.
After this question, I'd like to open up the floor for questions and comments from the audience, so be prepared and please feel encouraged to participate. Raise your hand and I'll make sure a microphone reaches you ASAP. Let me return to Najib. Najib, you work with Stand Up for Afghans. Could you tell us what you do? And then talk a bit about the position of Afghan refugees in Europe and specifically the Netherlands.
Well, I have a refugee background as well. I have been a refugee in Pakistan for 10 years. When the Taliban came, we had to leave because they were killing us. Just because I look Chinese and I don't look like an ordinary Afghan. So because I have this passion for doing whatever in my capacity for refugees, because I can feel them. I have organized my Europe-wide photo exhibition around Europe to raise awareness of the situation in Afghanistan. It was in Amsterdam as well, in Norway, and in Amsterdam I'm assisting many groups, especially Stand Up for Afghans, to advocate for Afghan refugees. So what has the European Union done with the Afghan refugee is that they have signed a deal with the Afghan government. The European Parliament, the European Union has signed a deal in 2016 with the Afghan government to deport 85,000 Afghan refugees from Europe in return of 15 billion development assistance budget, $15 billion. So European Union is paying development assistance to a country, to a developing country, and in return asking the government to accept back refugees. And in that document it says that Afghanistan is a supposedly safe country. What does supposedly mean? When you go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of any European country, they don't advise you to go to Afghanistan because it's insecure. But the Ministry of Interior of these countries deport refugees back because they think Afghanistan is a supposedly safe country. There is not a supposedly safe country. So there's quite a conflict between the ministries inside European countries on what they believe.
So there's a conflict between the foreign policy, which involves military intervention as well as exports of arms to certain regions, in this case Afghanistan, and some other policies, like policies on refugees and accepting asylum seekers. I would now like to open the floor for questions, answers. Answers will be from the panel. And comments, please raise your hand if you have any.
None.
There's one on the corner. I'll take care of it.
I'm sorry I came in late, but I just heard...
Don't worry, what's your name?
Nadia.
Welcome, Nadia.
Thank you. I just heard the last bit. You know, when it says it's not safe, maybe it's not, for us to go to Afghanistan. It's because maybe we will get kidnapped, right? Or so maybe
Afghans can get kidnapped as well.
Right, good point. But I'm just wanted to bring that up. Maybe it's because they're saying for Westerners, we stick out and, we're more of a target, maybe. So I just wanted to bring that up. I'm sure it's still not safe and all that, but just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, I'll respond to that. Your name, sorry, Nargis?
Nadia.
Nadia. Thank you for asking that question. That is a question a lot of Europeans ask. They say that, well, we are foreigners, we will be easily recognized. The problem is that 70% of the country is only controlled by the Taliban. And as I said, it's 21 terrorist groups in that country. 21 terrorist groups. And it is very insecure for any ordinary Afghan to roam around the country. You can roam around the country, but you will get killed. You will get kidnapped. You will be blown up by a mine. I had a friend who was accepted for a Russian scholarship. He was traveling to his home to bid farewell to his family. On the way, a bullet hit him. You know why a bullet hit him? Because he was sitting in a car like this, and he was not comfortable, so he had to lean to be more comfortable. And while leaning, he was shot on the neck. He died. You can die any second.
Thank you for that answer.
Yeah.
Saadet Karabulut, member of the Socialist Party in the Netherlands. You have a question or comment?
Yes, thank you very much, first of all, for sharing your stories. When I have this debate in Parliament with our foreign minister about prolonging the mission, the military mission in Afghanistan, and I confront him with, but you tell us that the goal of this mission is to make Afghanistan secure again and against the Taliban, etc., etc. When I tell him, but it's unsafe in Afghanistan. It's not safer than 70 years ago, and the Taliban, they rule in the country and they are part of the country. Then he starts telling me, yeah, but the Afghan woman, you want to let down the Afghan woman. If we go away, they will die, they won't go to school. What would your reaction be?
Many observers have indeed commented that the plight of the Afghan women is used to justify military intervention in many regions, including Afghanistan. Suja, could you talk about that?
Was the question for me? Yes, indeed, the Afghan women are used as an excuse, but I can't deny, I mean, there is a problem for the Afghan women. I mean, Afghanistan is the worst place to live in for a woman, but I find it a bit hypocrite to see that like you use it when you're having a political debate as an argument to win the debate against another person. But therefore, I find the history of the Afghan women so important, because looking at the support to the Mujahideen, there were also Afghan women who would be a victim of radical Islamist groups, and in that situation, the Afghan women didn't matter. So, well, you can ask the question, well, they didn't matter back then, would they matter right now? I'm not pretty sure whether the Western conception of how to improve women's position could be well if it's not thought through in a decent way, because if you only use it as an argument, I think that's not human. You should like the Afghan women should be. You should know why you're going to that country and what Afghan women suffered in so many years and what they need, and they can't just be used as an argument for your development practices.
Thank you.
Can
very
I
much.
add to that?
Yes,
as
very
well?
briefly, and
Yeah.
I'd like to give the floor once again to the audience after this.
Yeah, Afghan women is one of the most important issues in Afghanistan because they have been oppressed and still oppressed. But when we see the financial account of these development aids, the international community has spent $1.3 trillion in Afghanistan, $1.3 trillion. And only 0.7% of that has gone to education. Not only education of women, but education in the country as a whole. And how have they implemented education projects for women, for men, for boys, girls? They have gone to establish a school with a military convoy. The development assistance approach they have taken is pretty wrong. Doesn't matter if the projects have been for women or men. But they have spent $1.3 billion, trillion dollars, sorry, not billion. After World War II, the Marshall Plan only costed $150 billion. They have spent 1.3 trillion in Afghanistan.
Okay.
And still, the situation is getting worse.
Thank you very much. Are there more comments or questions from the audience? There's one here, another one there. Okay, I'll start here.
It was very briefly mentioned about private security in Afghanistan. Has any of that changed since the scandal with Blackwater? I don't remember exactly which year it was, but it was a big scandal with Blackwater and other private security companies. Has that changed since then, or is it basically still the same?
Yeah, the head of Blackwater, Eric Prince, was in Afghanistan 2-3 months ago to talk with the local stakeholders after his meeting with the White House. General Mattis, the head of the coalition army in Afghanistan, he was there to negotiate with the Afghan government to let his plan succeed, to support him. But everybody in Afghanistan went against him because Afghans believe, the president also believes, and the Americans now believe after 17 years, killing 500,000 people. 500,000 people have died after 9/11 in Iraq, in Pakistan, and in Afghanistan. And the Americans now are going for peace. Their general in Afghanistan said, like yesterday or this week, I think, that military war is not a solution in Afghanistan. We should come to a peace negotiation table. The Taliban requested a peace negotiation after they were thrown away of Afghanistan in 2001, but the Americans didn't accept this. It went on and on and on for 17 years now, killing 500,000 people around the world. And I don't think the private contractor is going to work. The Afghan government is against it, though some of the top leaders in the US is in favor of it because of affiliations, maybe with Eric Prince or something, but it's not the solution, yeah.
Thank you very much. Final question so far.
My name is Guido van Leemput. I have a question for Mr. Najibullah Assad. I'm puzzled on the fact that a great layer of Dutch society, Western society, which is progressive, has been convinced to support this kind of counter-insurgency warfare by developing the girls, developing education. You just gave the example twice, I think, on these convoy-built schools. Do you have more overview of an analysis of the results of this kind? Because in order to tackle this support of permanent warfare by progressive people over here, the well-thinking citizens, I think we should tackle this developing story. So if you have more, I would like to hear it now, or perhaps read it afterwards.
Specifically focusing on education, or?
No, just on developing.
Allow me to try and summarize. So there's a development discourse going on in the West. We, quote unquote, the West is going there not for certain interest, but in order to develop Afghanistan or Iraq or some other nation where there is involvement. And this argument very often works to persuade even progressive sections of society to support what, in essence, is military involvement for very different reasons than the development of a nation or saving Afghan women. Am I right? Have I summarized this correctly? Thank you.
Yeah.
So do you have a response to this? Do you have an analysis on how to neutralize this argument in order to win over those progressive people?
Yeah, I have worked in Afghanistan for 3 years. I've worked with the United Nations, and when UN employees or when embassy employees or politicians or anyone who comes from the West come to Afghanistan, they don't go to Afghanistan. They just get in their office closed by the walls and make policies and plans and strategies for the country. And what do you think their strategy will be? It will only be military, because they don't go to the villages to talk to people what their needs are, how they want their schools to be built. Do they want their schools to be built community-based? There has been a lot of community-based schools which has been very successful, not blown up by the Taliban. And about the whole development assistance and how can Europeans support a proper policy, proper European policy in Afghanistan, is to raise awareness about this situation in Europe. The project that I'm working on is a personal project. When I came to Europe, when I talked to people, when I told them that I'm from Afghanistan, the only thing they had in mind about Afghanistan was war and terrorism and Taliban. And seeing a decent person like me, they were like, what? Like, are you from Afghanistan? So I have this project to have my photo exhibition all across Europe to raise awareness of the country and to tell people that military approaches are not sustainable and are not going to be successful, and that when they are voting to a prime minister or a president, they should not only be concerned about the internal policies of that politician, but also the external policies, how that politician will impact a developing country like Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. Please join me thanking Najib, Azad, and Suja Shams. As promised, we will now have a presentation by Stop Wapenhandel, Stop Arms Trade, by Wendela de Vries, researcher and campaigner at Stop Arms Trade. She will talk about the current state of European arms production, as well as arms exports to the MENA region. Please take the floor and give her a hand.
Okay, I have only 10 minutes, so I'll try to stick to my written out text, and I hope I can get this working. No, I think I have to go this way. Well, it looks a little bit alike, but... well, I will show some figures and graphs on global arms trade and tell something about the political and economic processes around it. Welcome. Well, these are figures from the Swedish Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, showing the overall trend on global arms exports over the last 40 years. So you can see a drop after the Cold War, and you can also see that around the year 2000, the international arms trade starts to rise again, and that at present it is back at the level of the last years of the Cold War, and it is still rising. And bear in mind that this graph is only showing international transfers, so trade. It does not show how many arms are actually produced. Much of what is produced is not exported, but bought by national governments. So the total global arms production is much higher than this. One source estimated that over the last 15 years, the 100 biggest arms companies in the world produced for more than $5 trillion in arms. That is 5 million times $1 million in arms. So you can imagine it's quite big business. These are the major arms producing countries. You can see that the United States is by far the biggest arms exporter. This is the arms exporting country, sorry. United States is the biggest exporter, then Russia, France, Germany, only then China, although China is on the rise. And you can also see that the Netherlands, down here, is at the top 10 of biggest arms exporters in this period. Compared with the big ones, we are only small, only 2.1%, but for a small country as the Netherlands, it's quite extensive. The major Dutch export is warships, command and control systems, and high-tech components, mainly for military airplanes, such as the Apache helicopter. What you can also see that after the United States is the European Union, who is the biggest arms exporter. Already the 6 European countries in this graph together sell more than Russia. And when you take the 28 member states together and add up all the figures, they are responsible for 27% of all the total global arms export. So Europe is the second global arms exporter in the world. It is also relevant to look at the European level, because the European Union has a common arms export policy. And the European Commission recently started to promote Europe as a strong arms producer and exporter. So there's development there to increase it even. Advantage of the involvement of the European Commission is that the Commission is also publishing annual figures on arms export for member states. So for Europe, we have quite good information on the export. And when you compare that, for example, with the 1980s, when Europe companies were illegally arming both sides of the Iran-Iraq war, it will not be possible anymore that this goes on unnoticed, because the figures are much more in the open. So that is some progress, a little. We know more, but it's still increasing. As I said, the European Union figures are based on our licensed export by member states. So we have annual figures. Unfortunately, France is using another method of reporting, which make them not comparable with other countries. So France is left out at these most recent figures published a few weeks ago. In 2017, European arms export, you can see here, was 45 billion plus what France is exporting, which we do not know exactly, but will be between 6 and 8 billion. Of that, 13.4 billion plus what France is exporting went to the Middle East and North Africa. Most France export goes, by the way, to the Middle East and North Africa, so that will reasonably add up. And the biggest buyers of these European arms are Saudi Arabia. It's the top 1 importer of European arms. Egypt is also a big buyer, and the United Arab Emirates. Well, these are globally the biggest arms importers. The 10 countries on the right together are importing half of all the arms in the world. And as you see, Saudi Arabia is, with only a fraction of the population of India, has nearly as much arms import as India in this period. And right now, it's, I think, the major importer. Other big buyers are Egypt, Iran, Iraq, and Pakistan. These countries profit a lot from the American Foreign Military Sales Program, where the United States provides money to these countries to buy American weapons. So in fact, it's a kind of subsidy program for the American arms industry. And the troubles land in Egypt and Iraq and Pakistan. Egypt is armed because it is considered a very reliable military partner for Western countries. Never mind the repression by the al-Sisi government. Iraq, well, it's overflowed by arms, mainly by the United States, already for a long time, already when Saddam Hussein was our reliable military partner. Many of these arms end up with IS by looting and by illegal trade. It's the major source of the big IS weapons are from this trade with the United States. Pakistan was recently expelled from the Foreign Military Sales Program because it's not acting enough against terrorism, according to Trump. Now China is replacing the US as major supplier to Pakistan, and last year the Netherlands was the third largest supplier to Pakistan. Well, you must also know Pakistan has also a very bad situation with the basic education system, and I always think, well, they have a lot of schools which are only Quran schools. They are funded by the Saudi Arabia. And I always think, well, if all this money would go to education, how different Pakistan would look. Another one I want to mention is Algeria. Algeria, like Saudi Arabia, has a lot of oil, so it's an interesting client for the arms industry, although nobody knows who is going to invade Algeria. But the arms industry is happy to sell everything. But that makes neighbor country Morocco very nervous, and the Moroccan king doesn't want to have a smaller army than Algeria, so Morocco is also buying a lot of arms. Unfortunately, Morocco doesn't have much oil. So in the end, Morocco ends up with a lot of debt. And the arms import from Morocco goes very much at the expense of other important things that Morocco should spend its money on. So you probably all know about the Iraq movement, the protest movement in Morocco. They're protesting the lack of schools, the lack of hospitals, the lack of infrastructure. But the king has spent all the state budget on weapons and warships. And also when you hear about illegal immigrants from Morocco looking for a job in Europe, remember where the money went to that should have been used to develop Morocco. As I said, the European Union has a common arms export policy, obliging member states to impose a system of licenses for arms export. And every arms export has to be measured against these 8 criteria before a license is given, and goods can be exported from Europe. They have a lot of similarity with the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty, but these are a bit more binding because they are included in the European Union policy. And they look very nice on paper. Problem is that even if the intended export does not meet this criteria, it's not forbidden. Criteria have no juridical power. Only in the case of a real arms embargo, exporting arms is a breach of law, and in other cases, it's up to the national government whether an export can continue or not. So if we look at the case of Saudi Arabia, that's a good example for how this works. There's still no arms embargo to Saudi Arabia. The European Parliament has asked for it repeatedly, but they have no decision-taking power in this. And Saudi Arabia is terrible on human rights, both internally against their own population as in the war in Yemen. It is also involved in armed conflicts, criterion 4. Criterion 3, it's not preserving regional peace, is criterion 4. It's a threat to European member states because, amongst other things, it's covertly funding terrorism, which is also a criterion. It's violating humanitarian law on a terrible scale in Yemen, and so on, etc. In fact, Saudi Arabia is violating all these criteria, but still there is no arms embargo and the arms export goes on. This is how little power these criteria have actually in European policy. And these are the guys profiting from this. These are the top 10 biggest arms companies. They do not only profit from export, they also profit from military interventions. When the United States and its allies invaded Iraq in 2003, when Libya was invaded in 2011, you could see the shares of these companies going up on the stock market. Because shareholders know that when there is a war, guns and ammunition need replacement. For ammunition, you should not think gunpowder. You should think guided missiles, like, for example, the Tomahawk missile, costing $1 million a piece. An American journalist made a graph of the Tomahawk missiles used by the United States since the first Gulf War in 1991. So this is only the Tomahawk, only used by the United States. There's loads of more weapons, loads of more countries doing military interventions. So what you look at here is not only terrible use of force, but also a big business. And then there is another way in which the arms industry profits. Same companies that make the weapons for these wars are also providing security technology that is used to fence off the European borders, to prevent the people that flee from the war and the poverty to come to the safe and rich Europe. This is the budget of the European Border Control Agency Frontex. In blue, you see the present budget up to 2020. In yellow, the proposed budget for the new budget period for 21 to 27. A lot of this budget is going to equipment, and this equipment is provided by the military companies. So the arms companies profit twice from war. First by providing the arms, and again by providing the equipment to stop people that try to escape from war. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Vendela, for your very insightful presentation. Please take a seat up front because you're part of the panel. Of course, allow me, meanwhile, to introduce the other panel members. I think I'm standing in the light of the beamer. Our lineup is Frank Slijper, Program Leader on Arms Trade at PAX, Saadet Karabulut, Dutch Member of Parliament on behalf of the Socialist Party SP, Kati Piri, Member of the European Parliament on behalf of the Dutch Labour Party PvdA, and Vendela de Vries, whom you already know. Give them a hand, please, as they take their seats. I will start off with talking a little to our members to the panelists, and thereafter I will open the floor for your questions and comments, and I hope they are many. Saadet, allow me to start by asking you a question. Yesterday, you have asked for a debate with the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Stef Blok. I will not introduce the background, I'll leave that to you. And also ask you, after you introduce the background, what you expect from that debate.
Well, there's this non-lethal assistance program that the Dutch government started a couple of years ago for supporting so-called moderate rebels in Syria. And this was totally presented like the Afghan woman thing, non-lethal, to support the rebels who are suffering from Assad, forgetting that Syria is by a war-torn country. And it's a long story, but to make it short, a couple of months ago, I think in September, there were these great investigative journalists that make clear that some groups who are being supported by the Dutch government are kind of jihadist groups or working together with jihadists. So actually, in practice, on war ground, we are kind of making stronger Al-Qaeda. And secondly, that they are delivering pickup trucks and everything, and that the organization...
You mean the Dutch government is delivering pickup trucks?
Exactly. And the funny thing is, this all is a big state secret, we're not allowed, also me not as a, yeah, I can see it in, but then I'm not allowed to talk about state secret.
And if you do, you may end up in jail. That's the law.
Like for 6 years. So, this journalist, the newspaper and Vluchtroute and Newsuur, they showed that the commanders-in-chief there, the Syrian people, they were just talking about it, and it's very good. They are very useful for us. We're struggling against Assad. All this is, of course, in the narrative, and because of the Western war in Syria, they want to get rid of Assad. From their point of view, it's totally clear.
So we have an example here, one could argue, of Western military supplies that cost human lives.
Absolutely. It's an example of that, but also of secret warfare, but also it's typical Dutch, I think. It's like, we're developing, we're not part of the war, it's our way for helping the moderate Syrian people. But in the end, it ends up supporting jihadist group. And we had this debate in October, the first debate with the minister about this, and he said, yeah, but it's really, I can't tell anything about the groups, but it's non-lethal, the trucks that we're delivering and stuff that we're delivering is not being used in warfare. And yesterday there was this new investigation from these journalists that showed that they are being used for making war in Syria.
Just a technical clarification, the trucks that are delivered are typically used by rebel groups all over the world to make war.
And not only that, but also vests for the AK-47s. And
so what do you expect of that debate, and when is it taking place?
I think within 2 weeks.
And what do you expect of it?
And in the end, he has lied to Parliament, and you have to pay a high price for that normally, but of course it depends on what the Dutch Parliament wants, and of course there's also a coalition, and there's already the second foreign minister of the Liberals. The first one, he had to leave his office because of a lie that he told that he was in a dacha with Putin, so he left from that, and this is a second lie, and it shows also the way that in the Netherlands, but in general in Europe, that we're presenting the wars. Because I'm sure, and I know from the reactions from the Dutch public, that if people would know what the practice is in Syria, they wouldn't support this kind of help, if we shall call it like that, because I think you're just a part of the war and you're choosing side, and it's not in compliance with international law. That's also another big question.
Because these groups have been accused
human rights.
Exactly.
Yeah, and one detail again, as you know, that the Kurds, the YPG, and different groups, they are struggling against the Islamic State, and these groups, one of these groups, Jabhat al-Shamia, together with Turkey, they attacked the Kurds in Afrin.
Right. Thank you very much so far. Allow me to move to the other politician here at my table, Kati Piri, member of the European Parliament on behalf of the Partij van de Arbeid. It was already mentioned that there are European rules on selling arms. Vendela also talked about why that mechanism doesn't work.
She stole my whole speech.
Your whole speech, yeah. Which is why I have a follow-up question for you, and that is, given that it's so obvious that even people who are not experts, like myself, can understand that this mechanism is a weak one and it doesn't work, we can ask, why is this mechanism a weak one? Why has it been designed to be such?
It was designed by the EU member states, who clearly didn't want to have a mechanism which can prevent them from keep doing what they are doing. So the funny thing is, actually, this common position which was presented by you, it is legally binding, but there's no enforcement of it. There are different interpretations of it. There's no sanctions if you don't keep to it. So what's the use of having a legally binding agreement when there is nothing legally you can do about it, when you see that member states are actually not living up to that?
What do you propose should be done about this?
Well, actually, it was just 2 weeks ago that the European Parliament, you already mentioned, we had a clear position since 2 years, a large majority in the European Parliament calling for an arms embargo for Saudi Arabia and the whole Saudi-led coalition in Yemen.
To the background of Saudis bombing Yemen, causing humanitarian.
Because at least that's something, when there is an arms embargo by the UN or by the EU, that is something that all EU member states stick to. That's the number one principle of the common position. That's actually where you see no exceptions happening. When it comes to the second, point in the common position, is that you can only deliver weapons or license the transfer of weapons to countries which abide by human rights and international humanitarian law. Well, clearly we see that this is not happening when it comes to transfers now to Saudi Arabia. So in the Parliament we voted 2 weeks ago on this common position, which I think we can all agree with, all these principles that have been agreed since 2008 between European countries, but there needs to be a sanction mechanism. There needs to be a verification, and we actually proposed that there would be kind of supervisory, control mechanism under the, in this case, Federica Mogherini, the EU representative for foreign policy, that at least you can also check whether these principles are being abided by, which is clearly not the case.
But Mogherini, she wants a new war budget.
Well, let me answer that.
10.5 billion euros.
Look, one of the reasons.
Hold on a second. Please clarify what that war budget is for those who are not in the know.
They call it a peace facility, but the European Commission, they want a new project with 10.5 billion euros. So that they can make war in the whole world, and that they can supply arms in the name of peace.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a very political interpretation of
I am politician, like you.
Well, I know, yeah. So I don't agree exactly with that interpretation. What is one of the key issues? We try to have European agreements on weapons export, but in the end, it's member states who can decide. One of the reasons is all these industries are national. We saw here the list of Thales in the Netherlands. It's a big competition about a lot of money involving European different military companies. So we have seen in the past, the Netherlands, the Dutch parliament, for instance, decided not to send, I don't remember what it exactly was, to Indonesia a couple of years ago.
Leopard tanks.
That was it. Then the Germans sent it, right? So in order, if you don't want this type of negative competition between military companies, you need to agree on common European laws and develop a common industry on it.
That's clear. We're already speaking of what to do about the current affairs of arms export. Let me move on to Frank Slijper. Could you tell us, very short, what PAX is, the organization you work for? Then tell us what your organization is doing on arms trade.
PAX is the largest Dutch peace organization, and we work in, I believe, 14 or 15 conflict areas around the world, from Syria and Iraq to the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Colombia. And the team where I work in works on weapons-related issues, from armed drones to autonomous weapons, to cluster munitions and nuclear weapons. And in that team I work on the arms trade, and the arms trade project focuses on a couple of levels. On the arms trade treaty, that's the international level. We work on an EU level on common position issues with colleagues, and in the Netherlands, in The Hague, we try to lobby the parliament and the Dutch government.
How do you look at the issues that were raised so far in terms of the problems that are caused by arms trade, and what should the solutions to those problems be, according to you?
I think key, especially over the past years, is indeed the conflict in Yemen, where you see that some of the world's largest arms importers are continuing to get weapons from some of the main suppliers of weapons, despite what has been agreed in the arms trade treaty internationally, what has been agreed on an EU level, and fortunately, that's maybe just that little bit of hope you could have in this area over the past year, and quite cynically because of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. You see states getting to implement stricter policies on arms exports to Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, it's mainly countries who don't have the biggest interest in these arms exports. It's the Netherlands, it's Denmark, Norway, Finland. Germany is the largest one that so far has called for stricter, also on a European level. Angela Merkel has voiced that. So hopefully, but the two biggest spoilers are the UK and France, who just don't care about it.
So a boycott would be a very good solution. Moving on to Vendela, could you tell us, besides doing very good research and talking about it, what is Stop Arms Trade doing about arms trade?
Well, all kinds of things, but we are a very small organization, so research is a basic thing we do, and we also do actions, demonstrations. We organize meetings and discussions with politicians sometimes. So we think a complex issue like the arms trade you should address on all kinds of levels, but you should always do it on a very informed basis. So research is always very necessary.
Are you investing in creating coalitions with political groups that, to an extent at least, agree to your points of view?
Sure. Yeah, because we're very, very small. I mean, the arms industry is very, very big, has a lot of money. So the only thing that we can do is try to reach out to as many people as possible and to make the voice heard, because there are many people who don't agree with this. It's not the voice that is most heard, and they're not the people who are the closest to the power.
Yeah, let's go back to Frank Slijper. I think your organization was involved at least once in suing the Dutch government for approving arms deliveries to Egypt. Could you tell us about that, and could you tell us whether or not suing governments is a good strategy?
Maybe as a background, we did that case starting in 2015 together with Stop Wapenhandel and the Nederlandse Juristencomité voor de Mensenrechten.
So this is the time when the Egyptian government was crushing down on demonstrators violently using Dutch supplies.
It was actually more related because this was about naval equipment. So we had the focus of our case that we brought to court on naval equipment that could be used as part of the naval blockade in which Egypt is taking part in Yemen. And so, because already in 2015 it was clear that naval blockade was not just to block weapons coming in for the Houthis, but also causing a major humanitarian crisis by blocking humanitarian aid into Yemen.
The Houthis being one of the parties involved in the conflict.
And so that was the reason why we took this case to court, because we said, you have the 8 criteria, you know what's going on in Yemen, and still you allow these exports to go on to Egypt.
So how has this lawsuit fared so far?
Very long story. In short, it took us 2 years to hear that we were at the wrong court. So, I mean, and the background of this, we had, with many organizations, had another case against the Dutch state in 2002 as part of the Second Intifada. We wanted an arms embargo against Israel at that time. We went to the civil court, and then the judge said, no, you have to go to the administrative court. So 13 years later, we thought, okay, not to the civil court, we go to the administrative court. In the meantime, because of changes in how the Dutch link to European legislation had changed. So now the lesson is, next time we have to go to the civil court again. So, I mean, the lesson is, I think it's good because you can generate a good part of media attention for something that otherwise probably didn't get a lot of media attention. But it's definitely not an easy way to block arms export. But you see it happening all over Europe. Colleagues in England, in Italy, in Germany, suing both companies and governments because they see that through the parliamentarian way is often very frustrating and not achieving.
Have there been successful cases Wendela's shaking her head.
No.
No. That's a sad story about it, and also this story about this court case we had in the Netherlands. After these 2 years, of course, the military equipment was already exported, so we couldn't continue. We couldn't go to the other court because it was too late, and we did not expect the Dutch government to take the weapons back, because that would be really a scandal, apart from the economic consequences.
So hold on, I'm not an expert, so I'm going to ask a question that may sound dumb. When you kill someone, that's something you've already done, but you get punished for it. So they sold something that they shouldn't have sold, given the rules that we have, that we all agree on democratically.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're suing the government. I mean...
they gave the license, okay, so this is after the fact, a punishment could follow, right? That's how the law system very often works.
Well,
so why not in this case?
It was the administrative court, and I'm not a legal expert, but then I think you can only, the government can only say, okay, it's not okay, so you should not have done it. Maybe we could have retribution. Maybe we could have given that then to refugees or whatever. I don't know.
But it would have been a different case, because now we sued the government for granting this export license, not for what could have happened or has happened with it.
Right. Again, a question from someone who's not an expert. Often I'm hired because I'm not an expert, so let me ask that question. It sounds to me, given everything you said, that it's almost impossible to do anything about arms trade. Lawsuits, you can try, but it's not going to work because the system makes it very hard. The parliamentary way seems not to work. Getting the right media attention seems very hard, and even if you get it, maybe something's not done about it. Governments are lying, in the case of Stef Blok, but maybe also in the case of the Iraq War, as many researchers have argued. The Dutch government was participating, but we're telling the people that the Dutch government is not participating, so the public does not have access to information. What's going on, folks? What's happening?
This is capitalism.
All right.
It is.
Again, I'm not an expert. Elaborate.
Yeah, well, just for me as a human being, I really don't understand why because it's also society, it's not, we can't solve it on our own. We have to work together to cooperate. But how we can allow, sorry, I'm very tired. That's why my English is going like always. But why we allow the big companies to make profit on arms trade, knowing that they are dying, the children in Yemen and all over. So for me, what is happening at this moment with Saudi Arabia and Yemen and the United States and big powers supporting them, and the permanent warfare in the Middle East, also the big profits that are being made in arms trade, but also the oil industry, is really the very ugly face of capitalism. And I'm not saying that we can't change, because I do believe that as human beings, we want to live, we don't want to die. So why would we allow people to die, innocent children? But we have to do more. I think we have to change some things in the system, because the system is now working for these powers.
Yeah, I agree with most of what Sadet says, but let's not forget who the bad guys are here. I agree that there's a lot of money making in it. It's really a disgusting part of the weapons industry. And of course, their main buyers are states, right? So there's not a lot of, public opinion in between. It's a direct business with a lot of big companies with a lot of money and states directly. It's Assad killing his own people in Syria. It's the terrorists, some of the terrorists who were responsible for 9/11. It's not like it's a peaceful world and we don't need weapons, etc. So I want to...
But hold on a second. You have just argued yourself that Saudi Arabia, a staunch, historic Western ally, at least since the 1950s, has been receiving weapons from the West, including the Netherlands. And Saudi Arabia is bombing Yemen using Western technology.
Yes.
So it seems rather simplistic to say that the bad guys are the enemies, namely Assad. It seems that the bad guys are perhaps we and our allies. This seems to be what Sadet is to an extent arguing.
Okay,
what do you make of that?
I'm personally not seeing Saudi Arabia as my ally, but I see your point. But it's not the Dutch government, which is killing children in Yemen. I just want to. I just want
Hold
to.
on, Sadat, you'll get the floor.
I just want to make sure here that we can't just put everything in one basket and say we are just as bad as all these other people. What we have achieved, a lot of times national parliaments have blocked weapon transport. Unfortunately, the licensing is almost always given, right, to almost any country. We don't see, so when there is no public debate, when there's no debate in parliament, you actually see that this is just going even to Saudi Arabia, like we are discussing, and that's outrageous.
Let me ask you another hard question. You're a politician, you're able to deal with this. In the 1980s, the Netherlands was the third largest supplier of material that was used by Saddam Hussein to create biological weapons, which was used to kill the Kurds in northern Iraq. In 1982, the Dutch ambassador in Baghdad sent a letter to The Hague saying these materials are most likely used in order to commit genocide. The Dutch government did not take action until 1985, and even then it was only a partial matter. So in this case, who are the bad guys?
Saddam Hussein is the bad guy killing his own people, and
Not
we are
the people giving him the
facilitating
weapons.
And we are facilitating that, which is disgusting. But you can't put one equal to the other.
Okay.
But Kati, tell me what, because I'm not talking specifically about the Dutch government or the intentions or whatever, but when you see globally this warfare and globally seeing this permanent war going on for 17 years, there are now soldiers who weren't born when 9/11 happened, you know. When you see this, and when you see that the biggest ally, Western ally, the United States at this moment, not only with this jerk of a president, but also before, and their role in the Middle East, and their ally Saudi Arabia, are we innocent?
No.
Is
I'm
it
not
only
saying
that
we are
Saddam
innocent.
is the bad
No.
guy? Is it
No.
only that
We are not-
Assad is the bad
And
guy?
we are helping.
And this
And we are
narrative, you know,
continuing conflicts,
no,
for
but
sure.
but we also supported the illegal war in Iraq. So what I'm telling is not that the intentions are bad. Of course, the Dutch government, they have a restrictive policy for Saudi Arabia, for arms, etc., etc. But in the end, we are part of that big geopolitical power play, and it's not about human lives. It's not about helping the Yemeni people or the Afghan women or the Iraqis or the Syrians. In the end, it's about interest, it's about geopolitics, and it's also about arm trade. And what I'm pledging for is that this system that we have to change, and we have to also break with our own politics on this.
Okay, before I go, before I give the floor to the audience, let me return to the two members of civil society that we have here. Could you try and shed light on this? What should, according to you, civil society do, and civilians, ordinary citizens, about this problem?
Well, I think you're much too negative when you say we cannot do anything, because we can do some things, and Kathy mentioned that already.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes when parliaments take action, they can't stop certain transfers. Sometimes when things come into the public, exports are stopped. So it's a huge industry against, and it's a huge system of expecting democracy and women's rights coming from military interventions. But still, the fact that we are discussing it is already very important, and sometimes we have some little successes, and every success is something. I mean, if you see how small we are, how small the opposition is against these kind of things, I think it's amazing how much we reach. I think it's also amazing that the European Parliament is taking resolutions for a military embargo to Saudi Arabia. That's fantastic. It's not enough, but, well, it's the way we can come forward, maybe. I'm very curious about how it will continue in Europe with the relation with the other side of the ocean, because I think we will be stuck with Mr. Trump for a very long time. And I think Europe is not feeling too comfortable with it. I mean, I think most of the European politicians are not happy with what's happening. So I wonder what we will be doing as Europe. Will we oppose the American policy of extreme support to Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia? But I still think we can make a difference, and I really see it happening.
Very good. My question was also certainly not to imply that nothing can be done, but I wanted to specify what can civil society and what can citizens do. Same question to Boris Slijper, and hereafter I'd like to open the floor for the audience.
The other Slijper.
I stand corrected. Boris Slijper was my colleague at the University of Amsterdam. Thank you for that. So this is Frank Slijper, ladies and gentlemen. Are there any students of Boris Slijper in the room? One. Two, okay. Frank.
Now I almost forgot your question. What we can do? Yes, I think...
As citizens and civil society.
Yeah, working together with the media, for example, that's the way to get stories out into the public on public debates like this, to inform the general public and to try and keep this issue on the agenda, because indeed, if there's no civil society, there's no discussions or very little discussions about these things, and statistics are against us. It will not bring down the arms trade. It will not stop it all, but at least it will make sure that there is discussion in the parliament, that there is public debate about it, and through that you hope that governments, ministers will eventually, in the case of Yemen,
do something.
Yeah, take a stand and have an arms embargo on Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and all the other parties involved in the conflict in Yemen.
Speaking of taking a stand, I'll stand up in order to be able to look at the audience. I'm seeing one question there and another one behind him. Please stand up, introduce yourself, so your name, and try to keep your question as short and concise as possible, because we only have 20 minutes.
Okay, so the question is about the criteria. I was quite actually amazed about when you mentioned that they are not binding, being in Europe. So the first question is, who are the political parties? But there should be some legislation and effort to make them binding. Who are the political parties who are opposing these to be binding? For example, in Holland, let's start from Holland. Viewing that there's a clear link between all these exports of weapons and the refugee import to here, which was big time in the political campaigns. Everybody was talking about it, and indeed the public doesn't know that these refugees are coming because of the support of these extreme groups. Yes, you might oppose Assad, but I think you should be also equally saying we are not also supporting people better than Assad when they are fighting as extremists. That's one. Number two, what is the role of the media? So do you see the media in Holland really being transparent and exposing, again, the real story? Because I agree with you, if the people know, and why? We are living in Holland. Why the media isn't really exposing these things?
Okay. Who wishes to respond from the panel?
I can start, and you can. The first thing, the media. You know, I'm not a journalist, but of course I'm a politician, and I work a lot with media. There are really good journalists, you know, like the people Frank works together with, and also the people, the journalists from Nieuwsuur and Trouw, who investigated this non-lethal assistance. But in general, unfortunately, there is this narrative, you know, narrative of Assad is the bad guy, we have to support this, we have to do something, doing nothing is not good, and then the media is following. So, you know, the questions or the in-depth investigations, unfortunately, you can count it on one hand. So that's one part of your question. The second, well, yeah, maybe I can also give the floor to
Wenders, go ahead.
Yeah, about the criteria, I think all parties and governments in all European countries will oppose to make this really strict and binding, because they want to keep their hands free. To have, I mean, arms trade is not an economic issue. Arms trade is about foreign policies and about military policies, and governments want to keep their hands free to do all this. You do not even need these criteria, actually, because everybody knows you should not support human rights violations. It's clear, but that's international law, and international law has no power. So it only works when there is enough opposition from the civil society, enough pressure on politicians to put human rights and all the beautiful things we all want over military power and cynical politics.
Thank you very much. Next question, please, on the same side. What's your name, and please try to keep it short.
Yeah, my name is Tim. Thank you all for your wonderful information and sharing of it. Just a short question to Wendela. I didn't see any African countries, whereas I always had the impression that the West is also benefiting till this present day for destabilizing the African continent and all the conflicts there. And also...
there was Algeria and Egypt, so you're talking about sub-Saharan...
Yeah, okay, sub-Saharan Africa, okay, sorry. But because...
Well, it's important.
Yeah. But because the African countries, they are not big producers, as far as I know. Still, many weapons and bullets are being fired there. So are those numbers just too insignificant to the big economies that we've seen, or is it more the illegal arms trade? Is it that's why there are no numbers on these countries?
Thank you very much for your relevant question, Tim. Wendela?
Answer should be yes. You're giving all the answers already. These figures are based on financial volumes, and what's going to Africa is small arms, and that's a lot of very destructive arms. But it's
a lot of Belgians,
and it goes from Belgium a lot. But it's in financial volume, it's less interesting for these figures. And yes, there's also a lot of illegal trade in sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you very much. A question here.
Thank you. I'm Yael. Thank you for being here. I'm really inspired by this evening. I have a question on the lobbying side. I think you're working for PAX, who is lobbying on maybe different levels for a more human system of the weapon trade. But I was wondering, what is the role of the other side of the lobbying? I read some reports of Stop Wapenhandel, and I don't remember exactly the facts, but I think a lot of these weapon companies which were on the list, like Thales and Airbus, they had also a lot of lobbying meetings organized with people of the European Commission. Can you tell us something about it?
So a question to Boris or Kati, I'm sorry? To Frank or Kati, which one? First to Frank and then to Kati on lobbying from quote-unquote the other side.
Yeah.
Frank, go ahead.
Meeting in different meetings, because the arms industry is, of course, lobbying decision makers a lot, but not in the same kind of places where we do our lobby work. So, I mean, when we go, for example, to meetings of the arms trade treaty, the industry is not present or very little present, because they rather keep a low profile there, because they know it will only work against them. So they have their one-on-one meetings mostly with commissioners in Brussels or other key people.
Yeah, I worked now as a parliamentarian. I'm not in the Defense Committee of the European Parliament, but I worked as a staffer for 6 years in that committee. And actually all the lobby I had was from NGOs like PAX. Because they know the European Parliament is not going to buy weapons, right? So I remember being a trainee in the Dutch Parliament. There it's different. And especially vis-à-vis governments, it's different. When it comes to the European Commission, it's much more about legislation. Not so much about, the European Commission itself will also not buy any weapon system from big companies. So their only buyer are governments. So that's where their lobby is aimed at. And when it comes to regulation, of course, that's where at a certain level there is lobbying at the EU level, but certainly not in the European Parliament.
Thank you very much.
We meet them, though, in the Dutch Parliament, and the lobbyist from Thales Nederland always wants to meet with Sadet, but...
Useless, I would say. Useless meetings, no?
I didn't meet them yet.
I saw a hand go up there. Yeah, in the middle.
My name is Marina. There's two facts that stuck with me, and I would like to ask Kati from the European Parliament how to reconcile them. One is, I remember the Frontex figures, where you see not a moderate but a totally different magnitude of budget going to Frontex in the next budgetary period. Which you said, well, that actually goes to security systems, it goes also to weapons companies. And at the same time, I remember that you said, well, the European Parliament by majority opposes being very, very lenient, or they want to have an embargo on Saudi weapon imports. In this evening, you are making a link between refugees coming in on the one hand, which is Frontex, and on the other hand, weapons trade. To what extent is that debate also in the European Parliament linked?
So the link that we're making tonight, is that made in the European Parliament?
No. That's the short answer to it. Of course, I mean, there are many elements linked to it. This is certainly one of it, and I think it's very important to have such a debate. I have not witnessed a debate like that, at the policy level in the European Parliament. When it comes to Frontex, this is where, sometimes politics with media goes for solutions which are, which sound good to the underbelly, but which are not always the right approaches to the problems you want to tackle. To be honest, although we voted in the end for a much bigger budget for Frontex, and by majority also in the European Parliament, what you see is that cynically, member states, they don't want Frontex at their border. And I'm going to tell you why. Because they want to be able to do pushbacks. And they know once it's European Frontex agencies, these people will not do pushbacks. So the funny thing is that the solution...
Pushbacks meaning?
Pushbacks is illegally pushing refugees back at sea to make sure they cannot ask for asylum. This is happening in Europe. Look at Greece. I'm not trying... It's easy for me to blame the Dutch government. There are no boats arriving at Scheveningen. But there are pushbacks happening over border, over land, over sea. And the funny thing is that's one of the reasons why a lot of member states are actually not so keen on having these Frontex border guards, because now they have the feeling they have it themselves under control. Okay. And once it would be European border guards, they will have to stick to the European rules. So there's a lot of aspects in this Frontex thing, not only the companies with the radar systems and how that is working.
Thank you very much. A question here.
I want to ask a question to Kati. I heard you say that in order to avoid a negative competition between national arms companies, a common arms industry should be built, should be developed. How on earth could that be established? Is that a realistic goal in any way?
After we listen to Kati on this, I'd also like to hear the opinion of Sadat on this.
Well, good question. In a way, we have a European internal market, right? But we don't really have it when it comes to the defense industry. As long as you have armies, and we will continue to have armies still for a long time, you will always have a certain industry. And the question is this a type of industry which you want to keep nationalized, or is there a way to make it European? I think the moment you make it European, you can also have much stronger regulations on it. And now, for instance, where we heard some of the EU countries having a weapons embargo against Saudi Arabia, it would be logical that also in Spain, they would now stop in the port of Cadiz building the ships, which are still going to Saudi Arabia. The same in the UK, the same happening in some other countries. And this is, you are right, this is the area when it comes to foreign policy, defense policy, which I think a lot of European citizens would like to have more a common European policy, and where national governments feel that this is their basic sovereignty that they don't want to touch. So the question is, even if we will have it, it will still take a long time before we get there.
Thank you very much, Kati. If I understand correctly, there seems to be a proposal here for further European integration, and the argument is clearly that this will provide a more effective mechanism to better regulate arms trade. What do you think?
Yeah, maybe if you just zoom in on the arms trade, it would. But I think it's very difficult because, as Kati said...
Hold on, so you're saying this mechanism could in principle work better than the status quo?
When it could. If we would have an ideal world, And if the European Union would work for the people, then it could. But the problem is, and Cathy mentioned it and also others, that the foreign policy, it's our own sovereignty, and people, they don't want European Union and the European Commission to tell them how the foreign policy should be. So I don't think that this idea will be realized. But the real problem and the political problem is that also at this moment, the European Commission, they are trying to build on common European defense and also try to develop and also subsidize the arms trade companies to develop more arms. And it's not that the European Union at this moment with the neoliberal politics, that they want really different politics. But you see that Macron on the one hand and Merkel on the other hand, they want to be a big power so that they can influence African countries. And as we know, the Frontex and also the pushback and also the migrant problem, they are not tackling it, they are just pushing that, and they are building a fortress Europe. And that's the real problem, that the politics is not right. So at this moment, I'm not in favor of this development.
Okay, I understand. I've pressed very hard on Katie earlier on. Allow me to do that here again.
Sure.
Katie is proposing a solution that could work.
Yeah.
What is your solution within the current world?
Yeah, well, I think it's very important that we have these arms embargoes. And we have to push it also by the movement on the street. And I think it's very interesting. I'm also working on this issue for enforcing these criteria that we could build on a kind of monitoring mechanism. So I think now legally binding thing or enforcement, it's it's a bit of a no-go because there's no majority for it. But what we should do is, for example, with not the lobby, but with people like Stop Wapenhandel and others, that we build a kind of monitoring committee that can advise, that at least can say, okay, France, now you're delivering to Saudi Arabia, and
so you're looking at civil society here to participate and be integrated in the process. Okay, a question here.
We discussed the using development as an excuse and supporting moderate forces has been discussed, and I understand the critique of it. But do you think there are positive alternatives that the Western countries can do, or should Western countries just take their hands off it and do nothing?
Absolutely. To whom is this question directed?
I think you have an answer to it.
I think absolutely we can. If we stop supporting the war policies and the interests of other than the people, then we could help, but just by listening and working together with the people in the poorer countries in Afghanistan. So not that we take over their countries, but work together with. And of course, there's lots of poverty, there's lots of inequality. We could start with our own multinationals and companies to comply them to human rights. I think that would be really great. And in the end, development, it is a tool, and we could use it positive. But, and I think there are positive examples of development helping the people. But the problem here is, and the examples that I gave, is that they abuse it as a narrative to support a kind of war.
What positive examples?
Well, like I know a couple of people who have worked in Afghanistan, and they work from out of the communities, together with the communities, and also including Taliban, building on the communities and building on. It's not a lot, but there are some examples.
We have space for 2 more questions, and I will prioritize at this stage those who haven't spoken yet. So there's a question there. Any more? Is that a hand going up? No. There's one there, but there's also one here. Okay, I'll take 3 if you promise to keep it short. Chris.
All right, I'm going to struggle a little bit with keeping it short because it's a bit of a remark, but we had the discussion earlier about who are the bad guys. Maybe to make it a little bit easier, not to focus so much on those cases where we trade arms with governments that commit human rights abuses, but to when we do it directly. So when I think about the naval blockade, and the last figures I heard was 100,000 children dying in Yemen of diseases, immediately I'm reminded of images of the 1990s in Iraq, when we of course had the blockade by the UN Security Council, spearheaded by the UK and the United States, and the Netherlands was also on the Security Council at that time supporting that blockade. And the figures we heard were even much higher. We had UNICEF saying 500,000. A few years later, we heard figures from the UN saying over 1 million. We had the infamous interview, of course, with Madeleine Albright, the US representative to the United Nations, saying the price is worth it. And her predecessor said the exact same thing. So just to give that example of it's not just cases where we support other regimes, but in very, very high magnitudes that Western governments also participate in that kind of violence. Yeah.
Thank you very much. There seems to be a comment, so I'll move on to the questions. There's one here and one there.
So if the EU steps back and let's say they do reduce their amount of weapons that they do sell, is China and the US is just going to, they're going to step up and take the place where Europe is not selling? My question is, I guess, more to Frank and Vandela. I mean, are you thinking of working with this, groups like yourselves in the United States? Because it's not just a European thing. If you step down, someone else will take the place of selling the weapons, right?
Yeah, that's always the argument of the arms industry and governments. It's often used. It's not always that easy. I mean, the Western weapons are not easily replaced by Russian or Chinese weapons because the Western weapons are technically very advanced. So if you want to have a military superior army, you need these Western weapons. Yes, of course, we have also contacts with groups in the United States, but they have a huge problem in the United States, as you probably know. But when we start with Europe, we are already, disturbing a lot of the military plans that there are in Saudi Arabia, because there are really things that they buy here, and it's not so easy to replace. I mean, it takes years and years before a military contract is finished. It's not that they take it out of the closet and they sell it to you. It's not just a shop. So it will really help if we stop. Well, anything we stop helps, actually.
Thank you very much. Final question for now.
There seemed to be a very general consensus about how supporting specific rebel groups, for example in Syria, can really backfire, and it was very negatively viewed by all of you, I feel like. What kind of course of action would you prefer then? Direct military intervention or just leaving them alone at all? Because there was also a big debate about whether European countries or Western countries should go into Syria with military force. So would you rather then still supply specific rebel groups or just focus on direct intervention or just leave them alone altogether?
Yeah, first of all, I'm against any kind of illegal interventions. I think we must learn and we must comply again with the United Nations Charter. That's first of all. And secondly, military intervention is really the last resort that you have, and you must be I think the problem at this moment and the things that we're talking about and the big problems in the Middle East and the refugee crisis is because of military intervention. And I'm sure that, of course, Assad is not my friend, and I would like him to leave and come into court, etc., etc. But we can't go into a country and get rid of the people that we don't like. Then we should get rid of Putin, we should get rid of Erdogan, we should get rid of, you name it.
They haven't killed that number of people as there have been.
But they are killing.
No, but really,
they are killing.
We are putting everything on one pile here, and this is my
No,
problem
I'm not.
with the
I'm just explaining. I'm just explaining my position. And what happened is that the allies, the Western allies, together with United States and the Gulf countries, they supported jihadists. Also Turkey, they did. And they got the weapons into the country and they prolonged the war. So I'm not saying that we should do nothing, but we should cooperate and listen and work together with the people and not support other leaders who want to get into Syria because of other interests. So, I think in a war, and especially with these rebels, you must be really not deliver more weapons,
Okay.
We should stop delivering weapons to Syria, to Iraq, to Libya, to Yemen, because they have too much weapons.
There are all countries
no
to,
more
to
war.
who we have a weapons embargo. So let that be clear. We are not delivering any weapons to those countries.
Yeah, but the
When it
United
comes
States
to
and the
the
Gulf
example-
countries, they
Hold on,
are.
let us listen to Cathy.
The example of the Netherlands, I don't want to go into a national debate. This will debate for months, and it's up to the Dutch Parliament. We're talking about non-lethal assistance. So I also want to make a difference there. It's a serious debate, and I really think we have a serious problem. But we have to stick a little bit to the facts. We can't just put everything on one pile. We also, when it comes to the United Nations, we also made the agreement, we seem to have forgot, responsibility to protect. When there is a leader, no foreign intervention, killing its own people, we have as an international community a responsibility to protect.
So why don't we go
saying,
to Myanmar?
No, I'm not saying we have done that right. I'm not saying, and a lot of the Western governments don't want to put their own people, their own military on the ground, and no war looks nice. So, but as far as I know, the SP has never ever supported any military.
It's not true.
You have?
Yeah, we have.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, then I'm mistaken there. But military is never the solution, but it can be a part of a necessity that you have to do. That's not related to today's debate, because this is about the weapon business to governments, where we see, of course, that we are making a lot of money. And I'm not saying the West has always been on the right side of the events either.
I'd like to conclude the panel discussion here and allow me to thank Frank Slijper. Wendela de Vries. Cathy Piri. And Saadet Karabulut. Please take your seats. No, I'm sorry, we have to move on to the next part of the evening. Thank you again, members of the panel. Allow me to invite to the floor Jamal Badr. Where are you? Give him a hand. Oh, I'm sorry for this. Jamal Badr is a public health specialist from Yemen, residing in the Netherlands right now. He's also part of het grote Midden-Oosten platform, the Great Middle East Platform. We've started with the case of Afghanistan because it's related to tonight's topic, and now we would like to zoom in at the case of Yemen, which is unfolding right now, where again there's military involvement, including arms sales to Saudi Arabia, one of the primary actors in the conflict. And there's a humanitarian crisis and refugees leaving the country, among others, to Europe and the Netherlands. Could you, Jamal, thank you for being with us, tell us a little about the current situation in Yemen?
Thank you so much. First, before I give you the overview about the situation in Yemen right now, let me give you a very short explanation about how the situation in Yemen reached this point. I'm going to start with 2011. This year is the turning point of Yemen when the Arab Spring Revolution started. Millions of Yemenis demanding the previous President Ali Abdullah Saleh to step down. In 2012, Ali Abdullah Saleh stepped down and he gave the presidency to Abdurrabbu Mansur Hadi, but he didn't give him the power. He just gave him the presidency, and we will know that later. And 2013, 2014, Yemen went through a transition period, which is the National Dialogue Conference. And we had at that time also a draft of the constitutions. But unfortunately, Ali Abdullah Saleh with the Houthis, the militia, they didn't like the outcomes of this national dialogue. They made alliance together. Ali Abdullah Saleh with because he still has the loyalty from the military leaders from the army of Yemen. they invaded the whole country from the north till the south. At the time, the current president, Abdurrabbu Mansur Hadi, he left the country, he fled to Saudi Arabia asking for help and support.
Asylum, in fact.
Saudi Arabia started to attack Yemen for 3 reasons, actually. One, to restore legitimacy for the government of Abdurrabbu Mansur Hadi. The second one, to push back Houthis to their place, in Saada in the north. The third one is to help Yemenis. Unfortunately, the three of them we didn't see right now. Can you max the picture of Yemen? Now this is the current situation of Yemen. Briefly, I can tell you that the green part is under the control of the legitimatized government. The purple one is under the control of the Houthis. If you see it, you're gonna say that, okay, the legitimatized government, which is backed by the Saudi Arabia, is doing good, but the majority of this place is the desert. It's not populated by population. The one is in the purple, around 70% of the population is living in that place, which is under the control of the Houthis. So far, we have 3 million IDPs, internal displaced people inside Yemen. Infrastructure completely destroyed. Half of the health facilities are destroyed. Schools, majority are destroyed. Airport is closed in Sana'a. No salaries for the public servants. No electricity, no water, especially for the area which is controlled by the Houthis, which is the purple one. Even if there is food in the market, people, they cannot afford them because they don't have salaries.
You're a public health specialist. Could you zoom in at the public health situation in Yemen right now?
If I tell you that 55% of the health facilities in Yemen are closed, half of them, they are closed because they are destroyed by either air strikes or that Houthi militia are using them as military bases for their operations. So imagine that now the children the majority of the children are dying in their homes, and they are not dying in the hospitals because they cannot go to the hospitals if there are hospitals. So according to Save the Children, 3 or 4 days ago, they announced that around 85,000 children are going to be died because of hunger. Imagine we are in 2018 and thousands of children are going to die because they don't have food to eat. Also, we can talk about malnutrition, the cholera outbreak that happened in Yemen, maternal mortality, a lot of problems nowadays goes in Yemen because of this war.
Just to place things in context, Yemen was already before the current conflict one of the 10 poorest countries in the world. So this is on top of problems that were already there.
Yes.
Okay.
At least we were somehow stable at the time. Yeah, we have electricity. We have hospitals are working. We are not that bad like now. Yeah.
How do you judge the awareness of, let's say, the European public, in particular the Dutch public, of what is going on in Yemen?
I don't want to say they are ignorant about what's happened in my country, but to be honest with you, that European people and the Dutch people, they don't feel like these conflicts are affecting them. So that's why they are not interested to know what's going on in Yemen. Second thing, we don't have the location of Yemen is not that good like Syria. We cannot cross the borders so we can arrive to Europe, or we cannot cross the Mediterranean Sea and we arrive to the seashores of Europe. So there will be another crisis of refugees, because till now around not more than 500 refugees in Netherlands of Yemen. So that's why the people in Netherlands, they are not interested to know what's going on in Yemen.
So where are Yemenis that are trying to flee the conflict going?
Actually, they're stuck inside the country. The majority of them, there are around 27 million inside the Yemen. Those who came to Netherlands, actually, I'm one of them. We get scholarship to study in Netherlands, or those who have money, they can get away from the country. Otherwise, if you don't have the money, you cannot leave the country because the airport is closed, so you have to travel to the south. you need, and you have to travel to Egypt or to Jordan, and after that you don't know where to go, so at least you have to be rich man so you can leave the country.
Before I open the floor for comments and questions for Jamal from the audience, let me mention that Pakhuis de Zwijger is organizing an event where Jamal will also speak on the 17th of December, entirely dedicated to the issue of Yemen. Are there questions or comments at this stage? There's a likelihood that you are exhausted by now. Okay, so there's one there and one here. Maybe a question from someone who hasn't spoken so far. Don't be shy. Microphones don't bite most of the times. Is there a question in the back? Yeah, let's start with the back, then move on to the young lady over there.
Yes, I'm Abdullah. I'm actually from Yemen. But could you please clarify the saying of that Saudi Arabia fight against Iran in Yemen? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Or?
For me, yeah, what is going in Yemen right now, it's a proxy. It's a war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but they are not fighting in their lands. They are fighting in Yemen. So Iran, Houthis militia is backed by Iran, and they are fighting Saudi Arabia and but they are not fighting Saudi Arabia. They are fighting the government, the legitimatized government in Yemen, which is supported by Saudi Arabia. And also you can see in the TV, it's always they are shouting between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but they never do anything for them. Even there are a lot of commercial trading between those countries, flights between those countries, but when the time they want to fight, they fight in Yemen or in Syria or in Iraq. This is a problem.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Yes. I was wondering, how is an arms embargo against Saudi Arabia positive for the people in Yemen?
Actually, it's a great step for it to stop exporting or selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. It's one step for the peace settlement in our countries. For me, yeah, we have to deal with Saudi Arabia and with the militia, with the Houthis militia at the same time. But at least for the time being, if we stop selling weapons to the Saudi Arabia, it means that one of the parties, the conflicted parties, is going to suffer at least. Okay, there is no more weapons, no more airstrikes are going to attack the Yemenis people. So it's a good step, at least to begin with.
Final comment or question here. Okay, we'll have final two questions then. 3. Wow, you're getting excited. Okay, let's stick to those 3 and try to keep it short.
Yes. Do you think, or do you know that whether there are other parties involved? So is another country supporting Iran or another country that is supporting indirectly Saudi Arabia? So it's not a battle between these countries alone, but there are other superpowers that are involved.
If you follow the Twitters of Trump, you will know that Saudi Arabia is supported totally by Trump. And just 2 days ago, yesterday, he just wrote that, okay, the conflict on the Middle East, it's creating a lot of jobs for our nations in America. We are selling a lot of billions of dollars of weapons to the Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is totally backed by Iran, by US, and Iran is totally backed by Russia. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Let's take the question all the way in the back. And take this question after that and then go to the answer.
Hi, my name is Rana Norman. I'm from Yemen and I'm a researcher. I would like to ask you, how can we, as Yemenis, draw the attention of the Dutch parliament and how can we also try to understand the policy of the Netherlands as a member state who sponsored the Yemeni National Dialogue, and now, as in the news mentioned, that the Netherlands was selling weapons to Saudi Arabia or to America, and America sell it to Saudi Arabia, and now they are also supporting the peace process, but no one is clear about what's peace process. So I just would like to know what's your comment about this.
Okay, first let me say that I'm sorry for what happened to the great journalist Jamal Khashoggi during the past few months, but at the same time I'm so happy because of his murder. Now we get the attention of the total media of the whole world. I've been invited to 3 or 4 activities in Netherlands, in the TV. I write an article. I get interviewed in one of also the newspapers. So this kind of, what happened to Jamal Khashoggi for us as Yemenis is good. Yeah, I don't want to say that it's I'm sorry for him, but for us, at least, now
it's a development that can be used.
Okay. But I'm frustrated because we think for the 4 years that nobody cared about the Yemens, but when someone have been killed, now because now when they start to write about Jamal Khashoggi, they have to mention Yemen in the articles. For the Dutch society, I like this kind of activities. This kind of activities should be always conducted in Amsterdam, in Den Haag, in whatever, in all the states. So, and also, there are a lot of Yemenis right now. They are educated and they can speak and tell the people about what happens in Yemen. Okay. Also, thank you to the Red Cross Netherlands, Save the Children Netherlands. They have a lot of campaigns during the past few days.
Jamal Badr, thank you very much. Give him a hand. 30 seconds of concluding remarks. I thank Pakhuis de Zwijger, in particular Max, for the invitation to moderate the session. I thank all the speakers who have participated, and thank you, the audience, for your attendance and very interesting questions. Let us now look at the agenda of Pakhuis de Zwijger. Max, please assist. I'd like to highlight one that wasn't mentioned, and that is the Solidarity dinner held on the 20th of December here at Pakhuis de Zwijger, in collaboration with We Are Here. This will be a dinner with undocumented refugees in the city of Amsterdam. Please remember to pay as you like for this event using the link that was presented to you in the beginning, and join us for drinks at the bar. Thank you very much.